Well, hi everybody. Maybe we'll get a few more folks in, but we're going to have kind of an open conversation today. I'm Matt Nicely with Akin Gump. I'm a trade lawyer. I sit in Washington, D.C., and well more than half of my time is spent working on behalf of Abby and her organization, the Solar Energy Industries Association. And we're also joined today by Meredith Broadbent, who has some background as well on this topic, in part because we appeared before her while she was a commissioner of the International Trade Commission when the safeguard case was brought on solar panels and cells back in 2017. What I thought I would do is just to set the stage, just go through a few slides. What's that? Oh, should we go around to the whole room? And then, yeah, let's do that. That's a good idea. Jan, do you want to start down there?
Yes, I am also with Akin, as Matt is, and I am starting up the firm's policy practice outside of the US, based in
Hi all, I'm Advayot. I'm with Cuts International. We're a global NGO based in India with offices around the world. I'm also a trade lawyer by training, and I look forward to the interaction. Thank you.
Meredith Broadbent. I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we do all sorts of foreign policy, trade policy, environmental policy, energy policy work, trying to figure out proposals, getting groups together of things that would actually have some political traction and make it with policymakers.
Mustafa Bayumi, I'm a climate change research fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, which is the UAE's Diplomatic Academy. Sorry.
Hello, I'm Olivia Costa. I work for Tanzania Trade and Investment Coalition, where we look at WTO issues and trade and investment agreements.
My name is Herbert Shafero. I work with Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. It's a Pan-African research and advocacy-based organization that works towards advancing pro-development, trade, fiscal, and investment-related policies and practices.
Hi everybody, my name is Diana, and I am Public and Government Affairs with ExxonMobil.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ilaria Espa. I am an associate professor of international economic law based in Switzerland, and also lead counsel of the Natural Resources Program at the CISDL, the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and I work on trade and climate change, energy issues.
Hi everyone, my name is Marios Tokas. I'm a teaching assistant at the Geneva Graduate Institute in International Law. I teach mostly international trade law, international investment law, tax law. I'm also the trade and investment program manager at CSDL, together with Larry and Marcus and Sandra. And so I mostly deal with trade, investment, and sustainability.
Yeah, I'm Marcus Gehring. I'm an associate professor at the University of Cambridge, and I'm here as lead counsel for sustainable trade at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. I'm also practicing lawyer and member of the Frankfurt Main Bar and the Ontario Bar.
Great.
Hello everyone, I'm Sandra Lehman. I am a climate lawyer qualified in Brazil and New York. I am the president of the Environmental Law Commission of the Brazilian Bar. And I am a law professor teaching legal ESG and climate law in PhD and LLM programs in my home country of Brazil. Nice to be here today.
And a rock singer.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yesterday.
yes, this is correct.
I went to her panel yesterday.
Thanks for being here.
I'm Abby Hopper. I have the privilege of being the CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. So we are the National Trade Association for the solar and storage industry in the United States. There are a plethora of lawyers here, to which I will add my name, although I don't act like one right now.
Hi, my name is Simon Evenet. I founded the Global Trade Alert, which is the independent monitor of protectionism around the world. In my day job as an economics professor at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland.
Hi everyone, I'm Prasoon. I'm a co-founder and CEO at a climate tech startup called Billion Bricks. We are headquartered in Singapore, working primarily in the Philippines, but also in India, and we build net zero affordable housing.
Great. And you're playing musical chairs.
Hello, I'm Yasmin Ismail, Senior Policy Advisor at TESS, the Forum on Trade, Environment, and SDGs.
Great, thank you. So what we thought we'd talk about today is kind of using the United States as a case study. To some extent, perhaps to talk about, also to use a soccer metaphor, own goals. How we in the United States have, on the one hand, attempted to address and are attempting to address climate change issues, and particularly with the solar industry, but through various policy initiatives, kind of stuttering on that in some respects. So what we thought we'd do is walk through some of what's going on in the United States, using that as a way to kick off the discussion, so that you have a sense of what's happening there and why, how we came to this title of our discussion about trade tensions and climate change. Solar deployment in the United States, as you can see from the slide here, has, you know, if you go all the way back to 2014, looks pretty good, but it starts leveling out as you get, you know, as you go on. We haven't seen the kind of, I mean, as Abby will tell you, we brag about it in some respects, but on the other hand, it hasn't grown as much as it could have or should have. We have lofty goals about the kind of growth that we will see coming down the pipe, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Our solar deployment in the United States is driven almost entirely by imports, but that's part of the issue. Is what we've faced is over the years with a lot of trade barriers into the United States, causing our solar to be a lot more expensive than the rest of the world. And those challenges have been exacerbated by, as everybody knows, issues of supply chain challenges, et cetera, over the last several years too. So in terms of what are the trade measures that are in place, and from our perspective, it's sort of ironic that there are so many trade barriers given what we're trying to do with these products, which is to, you know, help solve climate change. We have, going back over a decade, anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases against China and Taiwan. We have section, under our law, Section 201 safeguard that started under Donald Trump in 2017. So that affects, obviously, imports of all products. Although we did get an exemption, which would seem to litigate about over on bifacial imports, which has become all the rage, particularly for the solar, for the utility scale industry. Section 301 tariffs, these are also, this is Donald Trump's trade war with China, which, by the way, both the safeguards and the 301 duties have been maintained by the Biden administration. So even though we call them the Donald Trump trade war, bottom line is it's the U.S. trade war. Both administrations basically agreed. And then most recently, there was a circumvention case filed by a tiny little company out in San Jose, California, called Akin Solar, that sought to expand the scope of the China case to encompass imports from 4 Southeast Asian countries, claiming that when you turn a Chinese wafer into a solar cell, they claimed and ultimately largely won the argument that is a minor and insignificant process that justified imposing duties, the China duties, against those countries. Interestingly, one of the more interesting things, and I think both Abby and Meredith will talk about it, is President Biden, even though this is a list of a lot of barriers, President Biden issued a rather unprecedented proclamation seeking to waive those duties for 2 years under the argument that, and the president's finding that there's an energy emergency in the United States, so that if those duties were imposed, we'd have a hard time meeting that energy emergency. Because we wouldn't be able to deploy as much solar. The other issue we face in the United States these days, and very supportive of this policy not to support forced labor, but it is an important mechanism that's affected our solar industry in the United States pretty dramatically, and solar falls in, by the way, to the electronics category. It's been hit more than anything else, and the other important thing for everybody to recognize is, because I think people think that the UFLPA is being used against imports from China. Well, in fact, most of the enforcement is against Malaysia and Vietnam, because they're tracing back the polysilicon from where the polysilicon came from, and 95% or so of the polysilicon and the wafers that are used to produce solar modules come from China. And so they've been when they're detaining product, they're actually detaining product coming from those Southeast Asian countries. So that's also been a pretty significant impediment to product continuing to come into the country. And then on top of all of that, you have the industrial policy of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is sort of a funny name for what is our industrial policy for the renewable space. Lots of lofty goals here. President Biden has said he would love to see solar be half of our U.S. electricity generation by 2035. You're laughing, and we recognize that that's probably an overly lofty goal. It's overly lofty in part because of these trade tensions that we've just talked about too, right? So, and we have lots of other kinds of industrial policy, both at the federal and the state level as well. So that's what we have going on in the United States. And it's, I think what we wanted to talk about today and get other people's input as well is, this latest event that happened with the Inflation Reduction Act gets us a lot of criticism around the rest of the world, but the purpose of it, and Abby, you can talk about how we were supportive of it, was aimed at diversifying supply chains so that solar could be more, that there would be alternative supply rather than depending so much from China and the Chinese-owned companies that moved operations or build operations in Southeast Asia. So, Abby, why don't we just kick it off with you? What are your thoughts on what the impact of those trade restrictions have had on solar deployment in the U.S.?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for attending this afternoon. As Matt said, this is a case study. Anytime I leave the United States, I'm very aware that I'm American, and I tend to view the world through a very American lens. So I'm doing my best to not do that, but also just to speak to what our experience has been, because I think sort of what it illustrates most poignantly is this tension between solving the climate crisis as quickly as possible and trade challenges, right? And we have hit it head on in the United States. We certainly haven't solved it, but that's where we are. So I was sort of laughing earlier. We have this beautiful graph that shows solar deployment growing year over year between 2022 and 2023. We grew 55%. And any industry in the entire world, no matter what you sell, would be anxious for growth rates like that. So it's probably odd to hear me say, these trade restrictions have had a detrimental impact on my industry, on the very protective of it. That's protectionism I can get behind. But it's true, right? It's a little challenging to prove the negative, right? What would have happened but for these trade restrictions, but we know that it would have been more, because part of my job is talking to developers and suppliers and financiers on a daily basis. And I can tell you both anecdotally and sort of empirically that there's so much capital that's been sitting on the sideline. There are so many projects that had to get delayed 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, that had to get canceled because with their trade restrictions, they just didn't pencil anymore. And so that's, you're talking about other areas. Mm-hmm. So that it has been fairly detrimental. I would say the other thing, and then I'll hand it back to you, Matt, is there's just so much uncertainty. We have this horrible expression, I hate it, it's called the solar coaster, right? So it's like, you know, a roller coaster goes up and down and up and down, and we are famous for our solar coaster. That's just a really bad way to do business, right? It doesn't matter what you're selling. Having an up and down cycle is a terrible business model. And so that uncertainty that trade restrictions bring in gets priced into contracts. It gets just helps companies decide which country they're going to deploy their capital in, right? Looks customers think, well, maybe not now, maybe next year there'll be different trade requirements and it'll be cheaper. So it also impacts it in a way that's hard to monetize and hard to quantify, but it certainly is a very real impact.
Right. I want to talk about the IRA, but before we turn to the IRA, Meredith, you want to talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on, given how important it is to deploy renewable energy, why is it that we haven't been able to, in the United States at least, and maybe this is a broader issue as well, come up with approaches to trade policy and our use of trade remedy laws to expand sustainable energy?
Yeah, and I sort of come at this from being a long-term veteran in trade policy in the U.S. I spent 20 years on Capitol Hill at the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, working on Uruguay Round and NAFTA and China PNTR and China joining the WTO. And then I was a trade negotiator at USTR and industrial tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And then I finished out my career in the government as chairman of the International Trade Commission. And that's, of course, the bipartisan, quasi-judicial independent agency that does the injury determinations, both for safeguards, where petitioners don't have to prove unfair trade, and then for countervailing duty and anti-dumping. And I'm a pretty Republican all those years, and was a Republican appointee to this commission. It's a bipartisan commission, and actually functions very, very well. And then I was appointed chairman by President Obama, because it rotates between Republican and Democrats, so he had to appoint a Republican. So I was down deep in the safeguard case in 2017, and we made an injury determination, and then the commissioners either work together or work independently on what the remedy recommendation is. And, you know, I had tried to kind of build some room in the market for growth of the industry. And I was way in the minority on the commission, and tried to be creative, because we were just growing at cross purposes, in the sense of, we really want this as a global good for the United States and the world, and, you know, then we're just crippling our industry with really high tariffs. And I think, you know, part of this is, when you come from the environmental perspective on things, coming to the WTO and so forth, as I kind of try to step back a little bit, I think it is almost really impossible to change kind of the structure of dumping and subsidy laws and safeguard laws in the U.S. I mean, it's very much a basis of our bipartisan consensus overall for supporting the WTO. It's always been kind of the trade-off. You open the market, but then your domestic industry would have access to protection under the safeguard for a limited amount of time, so that it could adjust and so forth. And then you're also guaranteed really a protection from unfair trade practices if you could petition and show that these imports were unfairly traded. And right now we're just in a very kind of crumbling, paradigm is shifting picture of trade policy in the United States, I think. And, you alluded to it with these Trump tariffs that were also damaging the industry and growth, that were kind of randomly put across huge tariffs across a lot of stuff, electric vehicles, everything really, just a huge amount of the tariff schedule got the Trump tariffs. And everyone was like, oh gosh, President Trump, and as you were saying, we could understand if the Biden people who claim to be so reasonable and everything would come in and at least adjust these tariffs or do anything, but they kind of validated them in terms of kind of where the U.S. is right now. And I think where we are is we're reevaluating what our trade relationship is with China. And I think if I had to guess, I think we're in for a big omnibus bill in 4 or 5 years, 2 years, I don't know. But I think we will be changing our legal trade relationship with China. And I say this as a person that went through the WTO accession process where we negotiated a great deal with China and we're able to give them permanent normal trade relations. But I can't say where we are right now because with any kind of big realignment, you just don't know where all the crumbling things are going and where people are going to land. And I thought the thing you mentioned about we had one issue related to the anti-dumping and subsidies and the circumvention case that was brought and maintained and affirmative ruling by the Commerce Department. And as the Biden people looked at what they were doing on the subsidy side, what the demand was going to be for solar panels and cells, they did what to me was really an extraordinary adjustment to this kind of commitment and it's not that it's a commitment I support, it's just reality when you look at trade policy in the US, but this was an extraordinary decision that the White House made, and I know Abby worked really closely with them to let them understand what was the damage that these tariffs were going to do on the solar deployment possibilities. And so you had the president coming up with this crazy, using authority that was really, if you looked at it, he was really stretching the law to use this. It was kind of emergency authority that you would use during a hurricane or a war or something, but not to then send a message over to the Commerce Department, do not collect these duties on the imports that were deemed to be circumventing from Malaysia and Vietnam and so forth. So that's a realignment going on in my view. I mean, because you had this really interesting debate in the House of Representatives where suddenly members of Congress who are very, very vested in these trade remedies were having a debate about could the president use this extraordinary authority to basically eviscerate this ruling and this protection against unfair trade ruling that the domestic industry had gotten. And so you had Democrats who tend to be more protectionist voting more so with the president. And then you had to liberalize, put a little bit of a hole in the trade remedy laws. And then you had Republicans who tend to be more free trade and don't always like the dumping laws, more like me, because they're so rigid and you can't take into account a lot of consumer issues and market issues and public interest issues. Just that's the way the law is written. But so you had this whole different, and the Dems that were generally more protectionist were siding with the White House that wanted to liberalize here, and they were taking on, which is the most politically, they were sitting there putting themselves up to be accused of being soft on China, which is a huge political liability around your neck right now in the United States, because everyone is just united. If they're united on anything, it's China's out to get us, and we're in a big global geopolitical competition with China, and China hasn't acted well for the last 8 or 10 years in the WTO. So it was interesting. So all I can say and try to make sense of all this is things are changing in the U.S. and the goal for green energy and new innovation in that sector and getting as much solar deployment as possible. There's just much more support for that. But it is something that's, and we'll maybe talk about a little bit later, but when you have a polarized political situation like we do in the United States, things have the danger of whipsawing back and forth between the extremes. And that's probably what's, potentially could come up after our election. So we're in the midst of a big transition, and then it's all in the context of this overall WTO, which is having its own problems. So I think we're at a really interesting time.
So as some of you may know, the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws that are applied throughout the world, most other countries actually have a public interest provision where they can use an exception. We don't technically have that in the United States. we have it with regard to the safeguard law, but it's really for the president. It's at his discretion, his or her discretion to use it. In the AD/CVD context, we don't, and what this section 3 that the president relied upon to put off or waive those duties for 2 years was, as you say, unprecedented. It is interesting. It has not only been used in the context of hurricanes. It was used by President Truman to address a housing shortage back in the 1940s. So it's not completely unprecedented to be used in this kind of a context. But
This was all the servicemen coming home from housing here.
right,
but-
exactly. In any event, Abby, what about the IRA? Maybe give everybody a little bit of background about how your association, your members got behind the notion of the IRA. It's obviously a hot button topic throughout the rest of the world because you're sitting next to somebody who doesn't necessarily support these kinds of subsidies.
The word is never coming out of my mouth.
Support is what John Newford said today.
Absolutely.
What can you say about how important the IRA has been?
Yeah, so first, is everyone familiar with the IRA is? Yes, anyone need a quick refresher? Okay, good. All right. So I spent at least 3 years of my life lobbying for the IRA. Had different names at different times, but certainly spent lots of personal and political capital on this, specifically at my organization. So sort of the question of like, how impactful is the IRA? I get asked that all the time, and I would say it's intensely impactful. A moment ago I said that it's just poor business to kind of have these ups and downs, and so I think the best, sort of one of the most important attributes of the IRA is that it provided a 10-year line of sight, right? 10 years of certainty with regard to tax credits and regard to sort of policy from the United States. Before that, we'd had sort of 2 years, ups and downs and ups and downs. So that alone has been an incredibly important part of certainty for the industry. It also incented other things like standalone storage, right? Before, storage was always had to be paired with solar, and now it can be used as a distribution asset, a transmission asset, any sort of fuel source. So that was an important one. And the other thing that the IRA did, which doesn't get talked about quite as much, is it was really the first time that the United States had used the tax code for renewable energy to really try to incent behavior. And so prior to the IRA, if you built a solar project, you got the tax credit. Like one thing, you build it, you got it. And now it is chock full of all sorts of social policy. So in order to get the tax credit, the 30% that our industry is used to, you have to meet, you have to have a certain amount of hours of apprenticeship on the program. You have to have prevailing wage. We have adders around domestic content. We have adders around sort of additional tax credit around building in certain kind of communities. We have additional credits if you're building in low-income communities. And so it is sometimes we call them Christmas trees in legislation, right? People hang all kinds of policy objectives on a piece of legislation. And so that has been an interesting way in which the IRA has directed development and investment to certain communities, certain neighborhoods. But the other piece of the IRA that has really been important from a political point of view is the manufacturing piece. There's support for domestic manufacturing in the United States now, which there never was before, or at least not for a long time. And so we're seeing that result in a lot of announcements. I always joke, like, I like announcements. Ribbon cuttings are good. I mean, like, groundbreakings are good, but ribbon cuttings are the best, right? When you actually build the thing. So we have, we're moving towards building the thing. We've had over 61 announcements so far as a result, a direct result of the manufacturing incentives in the IRA. But you can see sort of, you know, Matt and I appeared before Meredith, and I spent the first 4-ish years of my tenure here at SIA saying, no, 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 please don't hurt us. Like, please don't hurt us. Please don't impose restrictions. But I don't have an answer for you other than just let us import as much Chinese product as possible. It became very clear that that was not a politically viable solution. It may be the most economically efficient solution. It may be kind of the most commonsensical solution, but that was not the politics I had in front of me. And so we spent a lot of time figuring out what was the alternative, right? And a domestic manufacturing credit, but also part of why I'm here and sort of what we're evolving to is a more inclusive, sort of a more diverse supply chain, right? So thinking about who are the other countries in the world that are producing, that share our values, that are producing, that do have raw materials, that do have opportunities for us to partner, because given this tension that we all are aware of, I don't think that's going away. Whatever happens in November, that is not going away. And so we have to have some other policy rather than please don't hurt us.
Do you think the IRA is really it's sold by the Biden administration as if it's climate, fighting climate change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is it really about fighting climate change, or is it about creating domestic manufacturing?
Yeah. So there are a lot of words that never come out of my mouth, especially when I'm in the United States. Unfortunately, climate change is usually one of them. I think it is twofold. One, I think it is an economic development bill wrapped in a climate change wrapper, or sometimes a climate bill wrapped in an economic wrapper, right? Like sort of depending on your audience. But certainly, as a lobbyist who was pushing this bill, the economic development, the job creation, the innovation capture was a huge selling point. And then the manufacturing piece, I don't think we ever thought any Republicans would vote for this bill, but if they were going to, it would have been because of that. That would have been the hook. So I'm not sure. The jobs and the manufacturing in particular. There's sort of this special sauce.
I mean, I guess in the one point that I would make here, back on our broken politics and our, at odds situation, this bill there was really very little Republican involvement in this.
Yeah.
In my experience being at USTR and the Bush administration and so forth, it was unprecedented that the Hill would do a bill that had so many implications for trade policy in terms of, domestic content requirements are probably one of the worst offenses in the WTO. And all of these discriminatory provisions that are very offensive to the Europeans, the UK, Japan, et cetera, created just a spiral of kind of trade tensions out there. That if it was a bipartisan bill, I think it would have been written just much differently. It wouldn't have had all this social policy in there. It wouldn't have had the unionization requirements. If you have to have a particular child care center, I mean, the Republicans just are not comfortable with this bill. And so if, in fact, they were to win the Senate and keep the House, I mean, I think they would think very seriously about repealing all this. So, which gives you a terrible environment for business. Like, you think you have a 10-year clear certainty, and politically, we don't know where we're going. We're just careening, whipsawing back and forth, and this creates the worst environment for energy. So, my view on trade policy is that in all the years I did trade policy was you ended up at a bipartisan consensus in the middle of the road of both parties, And I can remember doing markups in the Ways and Means Committee, and there was a day when it switched and you were working together. A lot of times you had different original proposals, but it switched, and then it was the bipartisan Ways and Means Committee against the rest of the House trying to get working with the rest of the House, but trying to get a bill through. That made it so much more stable. And so we're at a point as the political landscape changes around the appreciation of the environmental challenge, it's just so much, you may be able to make an argument that it's much more stable and better for the environment if you can have a bipartisan policy that respects WTO rules, respects intellectual property, doesn't discriminate based on domestic content. So we, as I said, we're just at a paradigm shift, and we don't quite know where we're going.
Big aspect of what drove this piece of industrial policy was this perception in the United States that manufacturing jobs are the be-all and end-all. Right? When in fact, something we talked about in front of you back in 2017, the number of jobs downstream are dramatically larger than the jobs manufacturing the modules. Why do you think that we are so hung up on that in the United States? Why are we so hung up on manufacturing jobs when in fact, and a certain kind of manufacturing job, by the way, right? Because, you know, if you look at steel, aluminum, those downstream jobs, those are manufacturing jobs too, but we focus on the steel mills themselves, not the downstream folks. Why is it that both under a Trump administration as well as under a Biden administration, and everybody's hearing constantly still today here from Catherine Tai about the importance of a worker-focused trade policy. But why is that worker-focused trade policy so focused on that front-end manufacturing?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't agree with it. When I wrote my opinion in the solar case, I talked about all the jobs that you had educated me on and so forth. I think, you know, fundamentally, it's a union situation where unions get their workers to the polls, and so they're very much involved in fundraising for politicians. You know, I think probably solar workers are a little more itinerant, don't belong to unions potentially. I don't know exactly, but my sense is a lot less unions. So they don't have the ties to the local community, because when they're doing solar projects, they're moving more from, you know, finish a solar project, as I understand it, and then you go to the next town. So just look, you know, why in solar is there a discrimination against the solar jobs? But I don't know. I just think we just have this iconic, you know, retrospective look that the world was much better when everyone had manufacturing jobs, and they paid very well, and it was probably, you know, the 1950s when our economy was such that people got stable jobs and they could make $100,000 or equivalent at that time and send their kids to college and never have to worry about changing jobs again. And I think that's probably what we're planning for, but couldn't say for sure.
Yeah, I agree, totally. Like, there's this mystique about the manufacturing jobs that I don't think is particularly grounded in today's reality.
Right.
But yes, it is very much a look back, and then the political question is absolutely. If you look at sort of the organizations that supported this President Biden, the unions are incredibly important to his election and his reelection. And so there are a number, I mean, we could point out like this, and this in the IRA, in trade policy, that are really nods to unions.
Right.
Yeah. I've never been to an event with the president, and I've been to a number of them, where he has not been introduced by a everyday union worker. Like, that is his thing. And if you ever hear him talk, kind of not on TV, but just in a room, he believes it to his core and speaks about it from the heart. So it seems genuine to me, but it's also really it's quite a change in how we have to think about these issues.
Some people refer to Joe Biden as our most labor-supported president, Union Joe, since FDR.
But interestingly, those workers are up for grabs politically, you know.
Absolutely.
So that's what they're fighting
That's
over.
what MAGA, the whole concept of MAGA is all about, right? At least in part. So, we'd love to hear from other folks in the room, in part because this is a U.S.-focused discussion. In fact, one of the things we talked about in preparation for this discussion is that a lot of people in the room might look at us and say, why can't you guys get out of your own way?
We would agree with you.
And we would agree with you. But given this sort of case study, we're curious what other people think. And any comments? I got a hand over here first, so let me start with you.
Yeah, I have many more questions after your presentations, right? So I always thought the IRA is so blatantly WTO inconsistent, even more so than some of the European measures. And I'm sometimes puzzled because, you know, the US rule of law, including international law, has such, you know, reputation. You take people to court if they breach all sorts of rules. But on this occasion, there isn't even a country that has really sort of attempted to use the WTO dispute settlement body. They're like everyone raced to Washington, the Canadians first to get their electric cars excluded, and then the Germans and the EU, but no one really challenged the IRA. And I'm wondering whether, you know, that signals that even just putting a climate label on something can be helpful in international relations. The other question I had for you as lawyers in the room, we heard this week that Trump, if he becomes president again, would withdraw from the WTO in the first week. I was always under the impression that that is not possible without Congress actually agreeing. But you know, I look at the U.S. slightly puzzled, and I look at the U.S. Supreme Court and no longer fully understand where the U.S. is coming from. But maybe you can shed some light on that.
On your first question, I think the fact is particularly with the EV part of the IRA, it was evident that we had lost what used to be a relatively common protector, which was folks who worked at those committees that you talked about on Capitol Hill would be sort of the protectors of WTO principles. Yeah. And here came an instance where they let a piece of legislation go through that was so blatantly in violation of WTO principles that was the first, really, arguably the first time. Okay. So something has changed in terms of what folks on Capitol Hill. So it's not just about Donald Trump anymore, right? In fact, I remember, by the way, hearing one of the Georgetown updates in the last several years during the Trump administration. You had people from Capitol Hill who were, staffers for Ways and Means or the Senate Finance Committee, who would basically say, we actually support what Donald Trump's doing because it's the art of the possible, right? He's being creative in ways that, and the fact that you had Democrats, basically saying, so then if you think about that and you see what's happening now and the kind of rhetoric you hear from Catherine Tai, doesn't sound all that much different from Bob Lighthizer, right? So.
Well, I mean, I think we've got and I look at it, a bit of a constitutional crisis going on in the sense that our Constitution says, Article 1, Section 8, Congress regulates trade with foreign nations. Okay, practically all those members of Congress can't go negotiate trade agreements, but the way we've always worked it out in our system is a delegation of authority to this agency that reports very closely to the bipartisan Center of Ways and Means of Finance. And what's happened now for me, and I have just been through all these WTO meetings with different delegations, and we have, and I don't think Congress ever expected this, to have a USTR, and this is not the Trump stuff, but just a USTR that would do a big pullback on our digital trade objectives, which are very key to the competitiveness of our economy, sell out our trading partners in that regard, and go all the way to the left to placate Elizabeth Warren and the left wing of the Democratic Party for political reasons. I mean, that was just never, I don't remember, and you guys, I know you study this, and maybe there's other examples of it, but we're just with people that are willing to do that. And what that does to the U.S. position internationally is humiliating to me. I mean, I sit in these meetings with the U.S. business people begging the Europeans to stand up for us, and, and they're, oh yeah, we will, but we really want our audiovisual exclusion, and that's just something that, is so detrimental to our full-scale position, and I'm using the digital trade negotiations as an example. So, and there's a lot of congressional staff here from those committees, and they're taking it in, and I think the lion will roar at some point, but we're in a difficult spot right now, and we just undermine our effectiveness to get anything our economy needs, our strong, well-performing industries need, and we undermine our ability to build allies with the competition we're having with China. So we're hitting ourselves on a number of fronts, and it's very damaging and sad.
Real briefly on your second question, you know, I don't want to give them any ideas, frankly. But the fact is, we've been engaged in a lot of litigation associated with what Donald Trump did, and the Biden DOJ is defending what they did. But the fact is that the way the courts have ruled in many of these cases so far is to grant a significant amount of deference to the executive branch, notwithstanding that constitutional issue that Meredith just raised, right? And so it is, you know, I don't know that the rest of the world is paying as much attention to what's happening before our federal courts, but as opposed to WTO, you know, dispute settlement. But there have been significant decisions that, unfortunately, the courts have granted more deference than I think they should be, to the point where you have a bit of as you say, a constitutional problem, because there's no way that the Congress could have handed over that much of their constitutional authority.
And, you know, it was all, and I worked on a lot of these laws, a lot of the discretion was handed to the administration, never contemplating you'd have a Donald Trump who would use it the way he used it. And it's politically, I think, in our country, he's the validator in chief, and if he's going to tell constituents that they're being taken advantage of by the nasty foreigners, that just undermines all of the confidence that we have in our trading system, in our trading law and fabric. So suddenly the top validator in chief is telling you you're being screwed by trade, and it's going to be really, really hard to rebuild that confidence in our performance in the international system.
Simon, you have a question?
Yeah, more first perhaps to contextualize this case study of the United States by looking at the European experience, so that perhaps you don't feel so bad. The first point I want to validate is that when we've had changes in incentives, state incentives for adoption of solar panels and wind turbines and things like this, whenever those have changed, they've had really serious consequences for the commercial performance of some firms. And I teach the history of Vestas, which is a company which has gone bankrupt almost. Actually, it has gone bankrupt and almost bankrupt on account of policy changes on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I think that's point one. Point two is that this point about certainty is really absolutely critical. And one of the things which disappoints me when I look at the clean energy transition is, many of these investments are decades long, multi-year long, and we're not thinking about the private sector's incentives very systematically about this. And in fact, I fear that as the policies become more erratic, uncertain, and costly, then the size of the subsidies has to go up, which in fact then feeds into the potential for trade disputes. Okay, sure. So I think there's a sort of vicious circle there, which is not an American phenomenon, but I think that there's other points there. Third point, we too in Europe have enormous manufacturing jobs envy, despite the fact that the OECD showed pretty much, as Matthew was saying, that when it comes to solar panels, there are many more jobs in installation and maintenance than there are in manufacturing. Yeah. So all of that is there, but so I don't know if that makes you feel any better, but let me start with the problem, the last problem, which is I think even harder to deal with, and that is that if we're convinced that we need to have this clean energy transition requires huge amounts of subsidies, then I suspect the politics in most jurisdictions, not just the United States, will require politicians to set these things up in ways that generate local job or vote payoffs. And then you are going to run into trade problems, I think almost by definition. So there is this very strong tension. I mean, do we want to keep an open trading system, or do we want to deal with the climate change? Or is there some smarter way through this? And I would hope there's a smarter way through this. But at the moment, we're running up into this problem, and it is poisoning the relationship between between people who want to support a trading system, open trading system, versus people who want to make progress on climate change, and that's a tragedy. And you see that in these sessions here. Absolutely. So I think that's how I will put this together. We're in a hole.
Yeah.
You had a question?
Yes, actually.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a question that is pretty much unrelated to trade, but I saw from the data you presented there was a significant increase in generating capacity in the past year. And so I wonder what's the current state of environmental licensing requirements with regard to solar projects. And just to give you some context, some 10 years back, I worked in a policy proposal with David Hayes, former Deputy Secretary of the Interior, aiming at streamlining solar projects, which back then faced significant hurdles in the environmental front. But it always struck me as odd that climate change was largely absent from that discussion back then. So currently, climate change is definitely in the equation, at least nominally. And I wonder where the U.S. stands right now with regard to other environmental and sustainability requisites at large, such as protection of habitats that are relevant for protected species, and how this plays out in this reported growth and generating capacity.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. I work with, so before this job, I worked with the Department of Interior.
Oh, wonderful.
So I know David well. So the vast majority of the growth has been on private land. A lot of the work to streamline processes is on public land. Most developers tell me they don't even bother with public land anymore because it's just a pain in the ass. So that's one data point to say. That's what the market has decided. There is currently, under Biden, there is, I mean, this is such a tried and true phrase, but an all-of-government approach, right? Shocking. But there is, what I have noticed, having served in the government, is that at every agency there is someone whose sole job is to look at the climate impacts. So, Interior and the Department of Energy, but also Department of Treasury and Housing, and sort of across the board. So there is kind of a reevaluation and of how all of these different policies are impacting climate. I would say that, though, that so the agency that really tells all the other agencies how to do the environmental, CQ, how to do all of the environmental review, certainly has highlighted the impacts of climate as an issue. It is being litigated. When I used to do environmental, not me personally, but my agency that I ran, environmental assessments of oil and gas and of offshore wind. And so under Obama, we started doing evaluations of the climate impacts, like the upstream, downstream, whatever, I forget. After you drill it, then all the stuff that happens after that. It was, we were the first agency to do that, and we got sued, of course. And so that is a very live question about the proper role of sort of downstream climate impacts. Yeah.
Prasoon, I'm curious, after listening to all of us talk about our experience in the United States, what is, how do you react? Prasoon, maybe you can tell everybody a little bit about your business and how are you facing these kinds of issues, or are you facing other kinds of issues that stand in the way of the deployment of solar in your business?
I mean, I've got kind of two thoughts going on in my mind as I listen to you guys, right? The first one really is that most of us in the audience are not from the United States. I'm wondering, how are we processing all this, and how does it impact us, right? I find it like too alien for us to have direct impact or even have an opinion, because a lot of the things you're mentioning are more political than either related to climate change or energy or really solving any core problems internationally. It's really like how you want to play domestic politics at the same time you want to play international image building as well. For example, IRA being a manufacturing thing, but wrapped up as a climate change thing. So you kind of build these images, right? So I'm just trying to process, like, where do we come in as foreigners in this conversation, right? The second is that, I mean, our work is where we do a lot of solar work in Asia, in Philippines in particular. And
we find that solar market in the US is pretty mature, and a lot of the countries have kind of followed in their regulations and how they're building of what US has done. I mean, it was far ahead before kind of China overtook that graph that you showed in the recent years, right? And we find that the fact that the four countries that you mentioned, how the manufacturing has moved, has impacted in the sense that it's the Chinese company that are now manufacturing in those to get away from it. That has led to some level of like two qualities of panels that are available in the market. Do you want a Chinese one or do you want a Malaysian one? The Chinese one is primarily for Chinese market, but the Malaysian one's for the US market. So there's quality differences and the price differences, etc. So that is probably one small impact that we see as a result of it, that we have two choices and there's a price difference. But at the same time, I think it has led to overcapacity of being able to manufacture, but the demand being not strong enough for two different plants to manufacture. The world is still the same. The last is really what I wonder is that if the idea of putting these barriers is to see an impact on China and their manufacturing and their ability to supply, are there any studies to say that has really hurt China in any way and rest of the economy of that part of the world? The fact that they're not directly now selling to the US. And how does US perceive it, that as well, right?
I mean, part of the answer to that question is China's deployment of solar, it puts everybody else to shame. They're doing just fine using their own manufacturing capacity for their own market, and they're doing a great job in that regard. So I think one thing about you wonder about the relevance of this to the rest of the world. Back to your original question, and it sort of relates to some extent to what Simon was mentioning about subsidization. We are creating more production capacity in the United States. My own view is that most of that is going to get used in the United States. But there's so much government money flowing into the industry that it could end up being alternative sourcing for the rest of the world as well at some point. Who knows, right? In which case, then you really do have maybe arguably even more distortions caused by that subsidization in the United States. But the point is that, and I think I had a conversation with the folks at IRENA yesterday, and they actually have a position that it would be better for everybody if we did have, for everyone involved, not just because of geopolitics, but because of supply chain disruptions, et cetera, if we had more production, options around the world. I mean, take steel and aluminum just as an example. We have many, many, many options around the world for, production of steel and aluminum, buying steel and aluminum. You've got, right now, you basically have one industry, maybe they're in other countries as well, but you basically have the Chinese industry largely. Some Korean, South Korean, there's some Indian, but other than that, it's mostly them. Should we, for all of our sake, have a more diversified system? But how do you get there unless you introduce these incentives? That's the question.
Yeah, I think the opposite is also true, right? In terms of relevance to the rest of the world, is not only may we export at some point, we're going to keep importing, and we would like to have other options, right? And so for countries that are either active in that supply chain or are thinking about how to strategically align kind of their own industrial policy with an export policy, that is an area ripe for opportunity. Because even if all of my dreams come true and all of these things go from press release to groundbreaking to ribbon cutting, it's about half of what we think the domestic will be. And so there's still going to be half left to come from somewhere else. Yeah, we're never.
Based on current projections.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Like some other earlier speakers have alluded, the conversation is context specific, and we've been trying to follow and getting bits of the information, but it's very important to talk about it since we are not operating in a vacuum. We're integrated in the global economy. So I just have our perceptions at CRTNI that increasingly industrial policies, coming back. It's coming back on table, and there is increased appreciation of the same. Is it the same feeling from your side?
I mean, I think so, and I think there's some perception among some people in the United States who would tell you that the reason why we're doing it is in response to what is perceived as significant industrial policy being used in China, right? And so, I think that's the perception. That's the only way China was able to scale up, for instance, and drive down the cost of panels. The only way we're going to get there, or anybody else is going to get there, is if they pour government money into it the same way China did. So I think that's the reality. I think and if we had a working appellate body, if we had actually a system of dispute settlement at the WTO that was actually commercially valuable, not only functioning, but also commercially valuable, then maybe we could address these issues that way, but I think this is why.
Yeah, I would agree. We also think not just about our energy, but also the Congress passed what we call a CHIPS Act, which was all about semiconductor chips and manufacturing those in the United States. And then we haven't even, every state in our nation, all 50 of them, have their own policy about sort of what industries they think are important for their own smaller geographic area, and what incentives they want to offer to biotech or to energy or to pharmaceutical manufacturing. And so there's many industrial policies happening all across our nation. And then I do agree with you, like a larger one. Yeah.
Then lastly, we're doing some work around the Sino-Africa relations, trade and investment relations. And we recognize that China has really a strong footprint in Africa's mining industry, nearly 60%. And when we look at the solar panels, it's nearly 70% of the share, world share of manufacturing solar panels.
Yeah.
But also, China backs its industries and companies to go and conquer the world, like sends them to Africa. Is the US also taking the same approach?
No.
No.
I mean, in fact, on the contrary, one of the things that's all the rage right now, at least from a national security perspective, is outbound investment restrictions, right? So I'd say no, that's not the kind of policy you're going to see come out of the United States.
Well, you identify a really important point, which is that there is already, we've been talking about China and the 4 Southeast Asian countries, but the Chinese footprint is much, much broader than that. And so as I think about, like, we had the critical minerals conversation in here this morning, sort of what are all the other elements of our supply chain, where are they located, who has control over them, despite what country it's in, and kind of where are there opportunities to partner on those fronts as well.
And I think we're still at a formative stage of trying to figure out a China strategy, and I think we'll have some maybe changes in government organizations, more people appointed to write a strategy for where we want to be vis-a-vis China, where we want to be in the environment, and how do we distinguish what's national security, what's economic security, and it's going to take us a while. And I think following on to that, then we will be out doing more in Africa and so forth, and spending more and promoting more investment in strategic places where we need to have a presence.
But does that require government action, or I mean, in other words, why aren't businesses just doing it on their own, I guess is the question, right?
Because our businesses don't work like the Chinese work with their, Chinese businesses work with their government. But I think if you have a strategy, it gives businesses more certainty that they're with the program, and they'll have, the government will have more of their back if they're out someplace in Africa trying to get a mine going or something.
Right.
And I also think China is more aggressive, and it leverages on colonial ties, historical and colonial ties in Africa. Yeah.
Right. I think we're out of time, but did you have? Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm late to the discussion, but just hearing, don't you consider like the new U.S. investment in the copper mine of Zambia and the rail going to the Lombito port in Angola? It's like a direct response to China's
Yeah.
metal investments.
Sure. I mean,
Okay.
the
There's
question,
just
the
so few
question
of
is,
those.
It's discounted, then
the
the
question
revenue
is, the question is whether or not
strategy
it's,
to counter than there is directly.
but is it as significant as what China does?
Well, the US is playing it up, like it's their first foray into the
Right.
continent in response to China, so
Right.
it's just beginning.
Yeah, we're gonna try to do the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act in the next year or so, which may have some more directive in it to get involved.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.